The Everhart mansion stood like a fortress against the Seattle skyline, its stone exterior cold and imposing even in the warm June sunshine. Inside, behind walls of privilege and wealth, lived people who rarely looked each other in the eye anymore. Mariah Taylor adjusted her plain black uniform for the 5th time that morning, smoothing wrinkles that weren't there. At 28, she was the newest addition to the Everhart household staff, and arguably the most invisible. 3 weeks into the job, and the mansion's owner, CEO Richard Everhart, had yet to call her by name. Instead, he referred to her as the new one when speaking to Mrs. Winters, the stern-faced house manager who ruled the staff with military precision. "You'll be doing the East Wing today," Mrs. Winters instructed, her clipboard held against her chest like a shield. "Mr. Everhart is hosting investors this evening, so everything needs to be immaculate. Pay special attention to Miss Charlotte's room. She's been difficult lately." Mariah nodded, keeping her eyes down. "Yes, ma'am." "And Mariah?" Mrs. Winters lowered her voice. "Try not to interact with Miss Charlotte. Mr. Everhart prefers the staff to maintain appropriate distance from his daughter." Another nod, another, "Yes, ma'am." The routine was familiar by now. As Mariah gathered her cleaning supplies, she caught a glimpse of Richard Everhart crossing the grand foyer below, phone pressed to his ear, voice sharp with authority. At 43, he commanded not just this mansion but Evertech Industries, one of the largest technology firms on the West Coast. His tailored suit cost more than Mariah would make in 3 months. "Listen, I don't care what their lawyers are saying," he barked into the phone. "Tell them if they don't agree to our terms by Friday, we'll walk. They need this merger more than we do." He disappeared into his study without ever glancing up to the second-floor landing where Mariah stood. With a quiet sigh, she pushed her cart toward the East Wing, her movements careful and measured to avoid making noise. The mansion operated on an unspoken rule. Good staff were heard as little as possible and seen even less. The East Wing was quieter than the rest of the house. It contained the private family quarters, including the bedroom of 8-year-old Charlotte Everhart. As Mariah approached the child's room, she noticed the door was slightly ajar. She knocked gently. "Miss Charlotte?" "It's Mariah, She paused, unsure how to introduce herself. "I'm here to clean your room." No answer came. Mariah pushed the door open slowly and stepped inside. The room was fit for a princess. Pale pink walls, a canopy bed draped with silk, shelves lined with expensive toys that looked barely touched. But there was no sign of Charlotte. Mariah began her work, dusting the ornate furniture and straightening already perfect bedding. As she moved toward the large bay window, she noticed something on the window seat, a small leather-bound book with a lock. Charlotte's diary. She carefully moved it aside to clean underneath when suddenly a small voice came from behind her. "Are you going to read it?" Mariah startled, nearly dropping her dusting cloth. Charlotte Everhart stood in the doorway, watching her with solemn eyes. The little girl was dressed in an immaculate blue dress, her blonde hair pulled back with a matching ribbon. But despite the pristine appearance, there was something profoundly sad about her. Children her age should be running, laughing, making messes. Charlotte stood perfectly still, like a doll arranged for display. "No, Miss Charlotte, I would never read your private things," Mariah said softly. "I was just cleaning." Charlotte studied her for a moment, then entered the room and sat on the edge of her bed. "My daddy says it's rude to read other people's things." "Your daddy is right," Mariah replied, continuing her work but more conscious now of the child's watching eyes. "My daddy is always right. That's what he says." Charlotte swung her feet, which didn't quite reach the floor. "He says that's why he's the boss of so many people." Mariah smiled politely, unsure how to respond. Mrs. Winters' warning echoed in her mind. Maintain appropriate distance. But something about the little girl's loneliness tugged at her heart. "What do you think?" Charlotte suddenly asked. "About what, Miss Charlotte?" "About being right all the time." "Is my daddy right all the time?" Mariah carefully placed her dusting cloth back on her cart. "I think. Even bosses can be wrong sometimes. Everyone makes mistakes." Charlotte considered this, her face serious. "My mommy used to say that too." The mention of Charlotte's mother hung in the air between them. Everyone on staff knew the story. Amanda Everhart had died 2 years ago in a car accident, leaving behind a grieving husband who buried himself in work and a daughter who stopped smiling. No one spoke of her directly, especially not to Charlotte. "Your mother sounds like she was very wise," Mariah said gently. Charlotte's eyes widened slightly, as if surprised that Mariah had acknowledged her comment rather than changing the subject. She was. She knew lots of things, The little girl reached for her diary and clutched it to her chest. I write to her in here. Daddy says she can't read it, but I think maybe she can. Mariah's heart twisted. Before she could stop herself, she said, I write to my mother too sometimes. You do? Is your mommy in heaven too? Mariah hesitated, then nodded. Yes, for a long time now. Something shifted in Charlotte's expression, a flash of recognition, of connection. The distance between maid and child seemed to shrink, if only for a moment. Before more could be said, Mrs. Winters appeared in the doorway, her expression tightening when she saw the conversation taking place. Mariah, you're needed downstairs. Miss Charlotte, your tutor, is waiting in the library. The spell broke. Mariah returned to being just the maid, Charlotte to being the untouchable daughter of wealth. Yes, Mrs. Winters. They both replied in unison, then glanced at each other in surprise. As Mariah wheeled her cart from the room, Charlotte whispered, Will you come back tomorrow? I'll be cleaning this wing all week, Miss Charlotte. Mariah replied quietly. A tiny smile, the first Mariah had seen, tugged at the corner of Charlotte's mouth. The days that followed fell into a cautious routine. Mariah would clean the east wing, and Charlotte would appear, watching silently at first, then asking small questions. Where did Mariah live? Did she have any pets? What was her favorite color? Mariah answered carefully, revealing little but enough to satisfy the child's curiosity. What Mariah didn't share was the truth of her life outside the Everhart mansion. She didn't mention the shelter where she'd been sleeping for the past 2 months, after her landlord had doubled the rent on her apartment. She didn't speak of the daily humiliation of carrying all her worldly possessions in a single backpack, washing in public restrooms, and praying that her car, her only real shelter, wouldn't break down before she could save enough for a security deposit on a new place. This job at the Everhart mansion paid better than her previous cleaning position, but Richard Everhart had a 3-month probationary period for all new staff. No advances, no exceptions. Mrs. Winters had made that very clear during the interview. So Mariah kept her secrets just as the Everharts kept theirs. 1 week turned into 2. Charlotte began to seek Mariah out, timing her appearance with Mariah's cleaning schedule. Mrs. Winters noticed and issued another warning. Mr. Everhart values his privacy and his daughter's well-being above all else, she said sternly. Getting attached to staff is not good for Miss Charlotte. She's been through enough. Mariah nodded obediently, but the next day Charlotte was waiting in her room, sitting cross-legged on her bed with a photo album open before her. This is my mommy, she said without preamble, pointing to a photograph of a beautiful blonde woman with Charlotte's same solemn eyes. Daddy put away all her pictures after the accident, but I kept this one. Mariah hesitated by the door, Mrs. Winters' warning fresh in her mind. But the hope in Charlotte's eyes pulled her forward. She sat carefully on the edge of the bed. She was very beautiful, Mariah said softly. She used to sing to me every night, Charlotte continued, turning the page to show another photo. This one of her mother holding a much younger Charlotte on her lap. Daddy doesn't sing. He just says goodnight and turns out the light. Mariah thought of her own mother, who had worked 3 jobs to keep a roof over their heads after Mariah's father left. Despite her exhaustion, she had always found time to listen, to hold, to love. The memory was both warm and painful. What did she sing? Mariah asked. Charlotte hummed a few notes of You Are My Sunshine, her small voice wavering. Without thinking, Mariah joined in, singing the next line softly. Charlotte's eyes lit up, and she continued, their voices blending in the quiet room. When they finished, Charlotte was smiling, a real smile that reached her eyes. You sing like her, she whispered as if sharing a precious secret. Before Mariah could respond, a throat cleared from the doorway. Richard Everhart stood there, his expression unreadable as he took in the scene before him, his daughter and the maid, sitting together on the bed with Amanda's photo album between them. Charlotte, he said, his voice carefully controlled. It's time for your piano lesson. Charlotte's smile vanished. She closed the album quickly and slid off the bed. Yes, Daddy. As she passed him in the doorway, she looked back once at Mariah, a silent plea in her eyes. When Charlotte was gone, Richard turned his cold gaze to Mariah. Mrs. Winters informs me you've been spending considerable time with my daughter. Mariah stood, smoothing her uniform. I apologize if I've overstepped, Mr. Everhart. Miss Charlotte asked about the songs my mother used to sing, and my daughter has tutors, therapists, and appropriate companions for her social development, he interrupted. She doesn't need to form attachments to household staff, is that understood? The dismissal in his tone was unmistakable. Mariah was just the help. replaceable, insignificant, invisible. "Yes, sir," she replied, her voice steady despite the humiliation burning in her chest. "It won't happen again." He gave a curt nod and left without another word. That evening, as Mariah walked to her car parked 3 blocks away, staff weren't permitted to park on the property. The heaviness in her heart had nothing to do with her own problems. All she could think about was Charlotte's smile when they sang together, and how quickly it had disappeared at the sight of her father. In the privacy of her car, Mariah allowed herself a moment of anger. Richard Everhart had everything: wealth, power, a beautiful home, a daughter who desperately needed love, and yet he seemed determined to keep emotional walls between himself and everyone around him, including his own child. As she started the engine, preparing for another night of trying to sleep in the reclined driver's seat, Mariah made a silent promise to herself. She would keep her job, maintain her distance as ordered, and save every penny until she could afford a place of her own again. But she wouldn't forget Charlotte Everhart and the loneliness in her eyes, a loneliness Mariah recognized all too well. What she didn't realize was that forces had already been set in motion that would make keeping that promise impossible, forces that would soon bring her invisible struggle into the harsh light of day and force Richard Everhart to truly see the woman he had tried so hard to render invisible. The following week brought unseasonably warm weather to Seattle, the kind that made the Everhart gardens burst with color and fragrance. Richard had instructed the groundskeeper to prepare the east lawn for an outdoor luncheon, a strategic meeting disguised as a social gathering for Evertech's board members and their families. Mariah had been reassigned to kitchen duty for the event, helping the catering staff with preparation and cleanup. The reassignment was no coincidence. Mrs. Winters had made it clear that Richard wanted to minimize Mariah's contact with Charlotte. "You'll report directly to Chef Andre today," Mrs. Winters informed her, handing over a different uniform, a white serving jacket instead of her usual black dress. "Stay in the kitchen or serving area at all times. The east lawn is strictly for guests." Mariah accepted the new instructions without complaint. In the week since her confrontation with Richard, she had been careful to maintain a professional distance from Charlotte, limiting their interactions to brief, polite exchanges when their paths crossed. The little girl's disappointed eyes followed her whenever she left a room too quickly, but Mariah couldn't risk losing this job. Not now, when she was finally beginning to save enough for a security deposit. The kitchen was chaotic that morning, filled with the sounds of chopping, sizzling, and Chef Andre's rapid-fire instructions. Mariah moved efficiently between tasks, grateful for the distraction of hard work. She was arranging delicate pastries on a silver tray when she felt a tug on her sleeve. Charlotte stood beside her, dressed in a pale yellow sundress, her hair pulled back with matching ribbons. "Hi, Mariah," she whispered, glancing around to make sure no one noticed her in the kitchen, a part of the house she rarely visited. "Miss Charlotte, you shouldn't be in here," Mariah said gently. "Your father's guests will be arriving soon." "I know, that's why I came to find you." Charlotte's voice dropped even lower. "Daddy said I have to talk to the board members' children, but they're all older and they treat me like a baby. Can't I stay with you instead?" Mariah's heart ached at the plea, but she shook her head. "I'm working today, Miss Charlotte, and your father would be very upset if you missed meeting his guests." "He won't notice," Charlotte said, a hint of bitterness in her young voice. "He never really sees me anyway." Before Mariah could respond, Mrs. Winters appeared at the kitchen entrance, her expression shifting from surprise to disapproval when she spotted Charlotte. "Miss Charlotte, your father is looking for you. The Hendersons have just arrived with their son." She crossed the kitchen quickly and took Charlotte's hand. "Come along now." Charlotte cast one last longing look at Mariah before allowing herself to be led away. Mariah returned to her work, trying to ignore the hollow feeling in her chest. The luncheon proceeded smoothly. From her position at the serving table, Mariah could observe the gathering without being noticed. Richard moved through his guests with practiced charm, laughing at appropriate moments, nodding seriously during business discussions. He was a different person here, animated, engaged, present in a way he never seemed to be with his daughter. Charlotte sat at a small table with the other children, picking at her food and responding with single words when addressed. Occasionally, her eyes would drift to the serving area, searching for Mariah. By mid-afternoon, the adults had moved to the shaded patio for coffee, while the children were allowed to explore the gardens under the supervision of one of the household staff. Mariah was clearing the dessert dishes when she overheard a conversation from the patio. "Richard, I don't know how you manage it all," a woman's voice said. "Mrs. Henderson," Mariah guessed. Running Evertech, sitting on 3 boards and raising Charlotte on your own. She's such a well-behaved child. There was a pause before Richard responded. We manage. Charlotte understands the importance of my work. Still, Mrs. Henderson continued, it must be difficult without Amanda. Have you considered, well, has Charlotte had any maternal figures since? Mariah didn't hear Richard's response as she carried a stack of plates back to the kitchen, but his expression had been tight, uncomfortable. Amanda's name was rarely mentioned in the household, and it seemed the same was true in Richard's social circles. The afternoon wore on. Mariah continued her duties, moving between the kitchen and the serving area, invisible to the wealthy guests who accepted food and drinks from her tray without making eye contact. This was a familiar routine from her previous jobs, the art of being present yet unseen. As the event wound down, Mariah noticed Charlotte was no longer with the other children. Concerned, she glanced around the garden but saw no sign of the little girl. Mrs. Winters was occupied with directing the cleanup, and Richard was deep in conversation with 2 board members. Making a split-second decision, Mariah slipped away from the serving table and walked casually toward the rose garden, where she had often seen Charlotte playing alone. Sure enough, she found the child sitting on a stone bench, knees pulled up to her chest, tears streaming down her face. Miss Charlotte, what's wrong? Mariah asked, kneeling in front of the bench. Charlotte looked up, her eyes red-rimmed. Jeffrey Henderson said I'm weird because I don't have a mom. He said that's why I don't talk much. She wiped her nose with the back of her hand. And then he said Daddy will probably send me to boarding school soon because that's what rich people do when they don't want to take care of their kids. Anger flashed through Mariah. Jeffrey Henderson is wrong, she said firmly. Your father loves you very much. Even as she said it, Mariah wondered if she truly believed it. Richard Everhart certainly provided for his daughter materially, but emotional nurturing seemed beyond his capabilities, or his interest. No, he doesn't, Charlotte whispered. If he did, he wouldn't always be working. He wouldn't tell me to be quiet when I ask about Mommy. Fresh tears welled up. Sometimes I think he wishes I went to heaven with her. The raw pain in Charlotte's voice broke through Mariah's professional reserve. Without thinking, she sat on the bench and pulled the little girl into a hug. Charlotte stiffened at first, then melted into the embrace, her small body shaking with sobs. Your daddy is hurting too, Mariah said softly, stroking Charlotte's hair. Sometimes adults don't know how to show their feelings, especially when they're sad. Like you? Charlotte asked, her voice muffled against Mariah's shoulder. The question caught Mariah off guard. What do you mean? Charlotte pulled back slightly to look up at her. You're sad too, I can tell, but you still smile and sing sometimes. Mariah felt exposed, as if this 8-year-old had somehow seen through the careful facade she maintained. Everyone gets sad sometimes, Miss Charlotte. Why are you sad? Is it because of your mommy? Mariah hesitated, then decided to offer a partial truth. Partly, and partly because life can be difficult sometimes, but we keep going, don't we? Just like you're doing. Charlotte nodded solemnly, then reached up to wipe a tear that had escaped down Mariah's cheek, a tear Mariah hadn't even realized was there. The gesture was so tender, so maternal that it nearly undid her completely. We should get back, Mariah said, regaining her composure. Your father will be looking for you. As they stood, Charlotte took Mariah's hand. Will you sing for me again sometime, when no one's around? Mariah knew she should refuse, maintain the boundaries Richard had clearly established. But looking into Charlotte's hopeful eyes, she couldn't bring herself to extinguish that small light. We'll see, she said softly. Now let's fix your ribbons before anyone notices you've been crying. They walked back toward the patio, Mariah straightening Charlotte's hair and wiping away the last traces of tears. They were almost to the edge of the rose garden when Richard appeared on the path before them, his expression darkening when he saw them together. Charlotte, I've been looking everywhere for you, he said, his voice controlled but with an undercurrent of anger. The Hendersons are leaving. His eyes flicked to Mariah, then to their joined hands. Charlotte quickly pulled away, sensing her father's disapproval. I'm sorry, Daddy, I was just... Go say your goodbyes, Richard interrupted. Mrs. Winters will take you. As if summoned, Mrs. Winters appeared behind Richard. She gave Mariah a sharp look before leading Charlotte away. When they were alone, Richard turned to Mariah. I thought I made myself clear about your interactions with my daughter. Mr. Everhart, I found Miss Charlotte crying, Mariah explained. Jeffrey Henderson said some unkind things to her about not having a mother, and that's not your concern, Richard cut in. Charlotte's emotional well-being is handled by professionals, not by household staff who overstep their boundaries. The dismissive tone, the cold stare, It was all too familiar. But today, with Charlotte's tears still damp on her shoulder, Mariah found it harder to maintain her submissive silence. "With all due respect, sir, your daughter was upset. She needed comfort, not a professional." The words came out before she could stop them. Richard's expression hardened. "What Charlotte needs is not for you to decide. This is the second time you've disregarded my instructions regarding my daughter. There won't be a third." The threat was clear. One more misstep and Mariah would lose her job. She thought of her car, her meager savings, the shelter where a bed wasn't always guaranteed. She needed this position desperately, but Charlotte's tear-stained face kept flashing in her mind. "I understand, Mr. Everhart," she said finally, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside. "It won't happen again." He studied her for a moment as if trying to determine whether she was sincere. "See that it doesn't. Return to your duties." Mariah nodded and walked past him, back straight, eyes forward. But inside, something had shifted. For the first time, she saw Richard Everhart not as the intimidating, powerful employer to be feared, but as a broken man who didn't know how to help his equally broken daughter. And despite every instinct for self-preservation, telling her to keep her head down and her mouth shut, Mariah couldn't shake the feeling that she had just made a promise she wouldn't be able to keep. The following day, heavy rain pelted the Everhart mansion, matching Mariah's somber mood as she went about her duties. Mrs. Winters had reassigned her to the West Wing, as far from Charlotte's quarters as possible within the sprawling house. The message was clear. Another boundary had been erected between her and the little girl. Mariah accepted the change without protest, focusing on her work with mechanical precision. Her encounter with Richard in the rose garden had left her shaken, not just because her job hung in the balance, but because of what she had glimpsed beneath his cold exterior. There had been a moment, brief but unmistakable, when his mask had slipped, revealing not anger but fear. Fear of what, Mariah couldn't be certain. Perhaps of his daughter forming attachments to someone who could disappear from her life. Perhaps of Charlotte finding comfort somewhere other than with him. Or perhaps, most troubling of all, fear of his own inability to be what his daughter needed. Around noon, as Mariah was polishing the antique grandfather clock in the main hallway, she overheard raised voices coming from Richard's study. "I don't care what the projections say, Marcus. This deal is happening." Richard's voice carried through the partially open door. "We've sunk 2 years and millions of dollars into development. The board expects results. The safety tests are still inconclusive, Richard." The other voice, Marcus presumably, sounded strained. "We need more time before bringing this to market. Time is the one luxury we don't have. Evercore launches in 3 months. End of discussion." Mariah continued her work, careful to make no sound that would reveal her presence. Office politics and corporate decisions were far outside her sphere of concern. She had nearly finished with the clock when the study door swung open fully, and a man in his 50s, Marcus she assumed, stormed out, his face flushed with anger or frustration. He barely glanced at Mariah as he passed. Richard appeared in the doorway a moment later, his jaw tight. When he noticed Mariah, his expression shifted to one of cool indifference. "The library needs attention," he said curtly. "Mrs. Winters mentioned books out of place after Charlotte's tutor left." "Yes, sir. I'll see to it right away." Mariah gathered her cleaning supplies, grateful for the dismissal. As she walked away, she heard Richard make a phone call, his voice dropping to a tone she hadn't heard before, almost conciliatory. "Helen? It's Richard. I need to move our dinner to next week. Something's come up with the Evercore project." "Yes, I know we've rescheduled twice already, I understand." "Of course." Mariah didn't hear the rest as she turned the corner, but the conversation lingered in her mind. It was the first evidence she'd seen that Richard Everhart might have a personal life beyond these walls, beyond his role as CEO and father. The library was indeed in disarray, with books scattered across the large mahogany table and several reference volumes stacked haphazardly on the floor. Mariah set to work returning each to its proper place, checking the classification numbers carefully. The Everhart library was extensive and meticulously organized, Richard's doing according to Mrs. Winters. He insisted on perfect order in all things. As Mariah reached for a book beneath the table, she heard a small, familiar voice from the doorway. "Are you hiding from me?" Charlotte stood there in a blue sweater and jeans, casual clothes Mariah had never seen her wear before. Without her usual formal dresses and ribbons, she looked even smaller, more vulnerable. Mariah straightened, the book clutched in her hands. "No, Miss Charlotte, I've just been assigned to different areas of the house this week." "Because of yesterday? Because you helped me when I was crying?" The directness of Charlotte's questions always caught Mariah off guard. "I'm just following Mrs. Winter's instructions," she replied, avoiding a direct answer. Charlotte crossed the room and climbed onto one of the library chairs, her feet dangling above the floor. "Daddy's been on the phone all morning. He only does that when something bad is happening at work." Mariah thought of the heated exchange she had overheard. "I'm sure it's nothing to worry about. He gets mad when work things go wrong. Not at me, but he stops seeing me even more." Charlotte traced patterns on the table with her finger. "Sometimes I think if I disappeared, he wouldn't notice for days." The quiet resignation in her voice struck Mariah like a physical blow. She placed the book on the shelf and turned to face Charlotte fully. "Your father notices you, Charlotte," she said, dropping the formal miss for the first time. "He may not always show it in ways you can see, but he does." "How do you know?" It was a fair question, one Mariah didn't have a good answer for. What evidence did she have that Richard Everhart truly saw his daughter, truly cared beyond providing material comforts and educational opportunities? Before she could formulate a response, the library door swung open, and Mrs. Winters entered. Her eyes narrowed when she saw them together. "Miss Charlotte, your lunch is waiting in the dining room," she said, her tone brisk. "And Miss Taylor, I believe I assigned you to the West Wing today. I asked her to help me find a book," Charlotte said quickly, sliding off the chair. "It's not her fault." Mrs. Winters' expression softened slightly at Charlotte's intervention. "Nevertheless, you should both be where you're expected to be. Run along now, Miss Charlotte." Charlotte hesitated, looking back at Mariah with a mixture of apology and resignation. Then she left, her small shoulders slumped. When she was gone, Mrs. Winters turned to Mariah. "This cannot continue, Miss Taylor. Mr. Everhart has been extremely clear about his expectations." "I understand," Mariah replied, keeping her voice neutral despite the frustration building inside her. "I wasn't seeking out Miss Charlotte. She came here while I was working. Then you should have excused yourself immediately." Mrs. Winters sighed, her stern demeanor slipping for just a moment. "Look, I know the child is seeking connection, but getting attached to household staff isn't good for her. People in our position come and go. Surely you understand that." The words "our position" caught Mariah's attention, a rare acknowledgement that Mrs. Winters, for all her authority within the household, was still staff too, still someone who could be dismissed at Richard Everhart's whim. "I do understand," Mariah said, "and I'm trying to maintain appropriate boundaries, but Miss Charlotte is." She hesitated, then continued carefully. "She's a lonely child, Mrs. Winters. Surely you've noticed." Something flickered across the older woman's face, concern, perhaps, or recognition, but it quickly vanished, replaced by her usual professional mask. "That may be so, but it's not our place to address it. Mr. Everhart has his reasons for running his household as he sees fit." She straightened her already impeccable blazer. "Finish here, then report to the West Wing as instructed." As Mrs. Winters left, Mariah felt a weight pressing down on her. The oppressive silence of the mansion, the unspoken rules, the careful distance everyone maintained from one another. It was a house full of people who rarely connected in any meaningful way. The rest of the day passed without incident. Mariah kept to her assigned areas, completed her tasks with efficiency, and avoided both Charlotte and Richard. But as evening approached, bringing with it another night of sleeping in her car or hoping for a bed at the shelter, the strain of her double life began to take its toll. In the staff changing room, as she prepared to leave for the day, Mariah's hands trembled slightly as she buttoned her worn coat. The shelter had been full the past 2 nights, forcing her to sleep in her car parked in a 24-hour supermarket lot. Her back ached from the cramped quarters, and she hadn't been able to shower properly since using the staff facilities the day before. "Are you feeling all right?" Mariah turned to find Elena, one of the kitchen staff, watching her with concern. In her 30s and a single mother of 2, Elena had been friendly to Mariah from her first day, offering advice about the household's routines and preferences. "I'm fine," Mariah said automatically. "Just tired." Elena studied her for a moment longer, then reached into her bag and pulled out a plastic container. "Here, take this. Leftover salmon from lunch. Chef would just throw it out anyway." Mariah hesitated. Staff were strictly forbidden from taking food home, another of Richard's rules, but her stomach clenched at the thought of another dinner of crackers and peanut butter, the cheapest meal she could afford while saving every possible dollar. "It's okay," Elena said quietly, pressing the container into Mariah's hands. "Everyone does it. Just be discreet." "Thank you," Mariah whispered, tucking the container into her backpack, the same backpack that held all her worldly possessions. Elena nodded, then lowered her voice further. Listen, a bunch of us are going for drinks Friday after work. You should come. It helps. You know, to talk to people who understand what it's like here. The invitation was unexpected and touching. I'd like that, Mariah said, meaning it. Thank you. As they left together, walking toward the staff exit at the rear of the mansion, Mariah felt a small measure of the day's tension ease. Perhaps making connections here, with her fellow staff, if not with Charlotte, wouldn't be impossible after all. They had just stepped outside when Mariah spotted a familiar car pulling into the circular driveway at the front of the house. Richard's sleek black Tesla. He wasn't usually home this early. As she watched, the car came to a stop, and Richard emerged, followed by Charlotte. They must have been out together, a rare occurrence based on what Mariah had observed thus far. Looks like the boss is in a good mood, Elena commented, following Mariah's gaze. That doesn't happen often these days. Indeed, Richard was smiling, a genuine smile that transformed his usually stern face. He said something to Charlotte that Mariah couldn't hear, and the little girl laughed, the sound carrying across the evening air. They went to the science center, Elena explained. It's their thing, once a month if he's not too busy. Been doing it since Miss Charlotte was tiny, back when Mrs. Everhart was still alive. Mariah watched as father and daughter walked toward the main entrance, Charlotte chattering animatedly, Richard nodding with apparent interest. It was a side of their relationship she hadn't witnessed before, a glimpse of connection that contradicted Charlotte's belief that her father didn't see her. He does love her, Mariah murmured, more to herself than to Elena. In his way, Elena agreed. But after Mrs. Everhart died, something broke in him. He buried himself in work, hired more staff to care for Miss Charlotte. Everyone says he was different before, warmer, more present. They turned to continue toward the staff parking area, but not before Mariah caught a final glimpse of Richard and Charlotte entering the house. Just before the door closed behind them, she saw Richard's hand come to rest gently on Charlotte's shoulder, a small gesture but one that spoke volumes. The rain had stopped, but the evening air was damp and chilly. Mariah pulled her coat tighter around herself as she and Elena parted ways at the edge of the property. See you tomorrow, Elena called as she headed toward her car. See you tomorrow, Mariah echoed, though her own destination was far less certain. The walk to where she'd parked her car took about 15 minutes. 15 minutes to transition from the rarefied world of the Everhart mansion to the reality of her situation. With each step, the weight she had momentarily escaped settled back onto her shoulders. Her ancient Honda was where she'd left it, parked on a side street where overnight parking was permitted. As she approached, Mariah immediately sensed something was wrong. The driver's side window was shattered, glass scattered across the seat and the pavement below. No, 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 she whispered, rushing forward. She whispered. The car had been broken into, her small suitcase of clothes taken along with the emergency cash she'd hidden under the seat. $37. Money that had been earmarked for gas and a cheap gym membership so she could shower regularly. Gone. Mariah stood motionless beside the violated car, staring at the empty space where her few possessions had been. The reality of her situation crashed over her like a wave. Homeless, now with even less than before, working in a mansion filled with more wealth than she could comprehend. She sank to her knees beside the car, hands shaking as she gathered shards of glass from the seat. What now? She couldn't afford to fix the window. Couldn't sleep in a car with no window, especially not with rain in the forecast. The shelter would be her only option tonight, if they had space. As darkness fell, Mariah found herself walking toward the downtown shelter, her backpack, containing her work uniform, Elena's gifted salmon, and little else, slung over her shoulder. The distance was considerable, but she couldn't afford a bus fare. The shelter was crowded when she arrived, the line for beds already stretching down the block. Mariah took her place at the end, praying they wouldn't reach capacity before she made it inside. First time? Asked the woman behind her, a weathered-looking individual in her 60s. No, Mariah replied quietly. Third time this week. The woman nodded, understanding without judgment. Rough out there. Rent's criminal these days. Yeah. They fell into silence, two strangers united by circumstance waiting for basic shelter that wasn't guaranteed. An hour later, Mariah stood before the intake desk, her exhaustion evident in every line of her body. Taylor, Mariah, she told the volunteer, a kind-faced man who checked his computer with practiced efficiency. You're in luck, he said. We have one bed left. Women's dormitory, second floor. Relief washed over her. Thank you, The dormitory was a large room filled with narrow cots, separated by thin curtains for minimal privacy. Mariah found her assigned bed and sat down heavily, the events of the day finally catching up with her. She opened her backpack and withdrew Elena's container of salmon, eating it cold with her fingers. It was the first proper meal she'd had in days, and despite the circumstances, she savored every bite. Afterward, she changed into the shelter-provided night clothes and slipped under the thin blanket. Around her, other women were settling in for the night, some reading by small booklights, others talking quietly, many already asleep, exhausted by their own daily struggles. Mariah stared at the ceiling, thinking about the contrast between this room and Charlotte's princess bedroom in the Everhart mansion. Two different worlds, separated by wealth, privilege, and circumstance. And yet she couldn't help but recognize a commonality between herself and the little girl, a shared loneliness, a sense of being adrift. Tomorrow she would have to figure out what to do about her car, find a way to secure her few remaining possessions, and somehow maintain the appearance of stability that her job at the Everhart mansion required. For now, though, she allowed herself to close her eyes, grateful at least for a roof over her head and a bed beneath her body. Sleep came quickly, her dreams a confused jumble of images: Richard's rare smile, Charlotte's tears, the broken window of her car, the immaculate corridors of the mansion. In one particularly vivid sequence, she stood in the Everhart garden, singing "You Are My Sunshine" while Charlotte danced around her. As the song ended, Charlotte looked up and said words that echoed from their conversation in the library. "Sometimes I think if I disappeared, he wouldn't notice for days." But in the dream, Mariah answered differently. "If you disappeared, Charlotte, I would notice. I would look for you. I would find you." The dream shifted, and suddenly it was Richard standing before her, his expression not cold but broken, vulnerable. "Would you do the same for me?" he asked. "Would you notice if I disappeared?" Mariah woke with a start, the dream still vivid in her mind. The dormitory was quiet now, the only sounds the soft breathing of sleeping women and the occasional creak of a cot. Outside, rain had begun to fall again, pattering against the windows. In that moment, lying in a shelter bed while rain fell on a city full of both plenty and want, Mariah made a decision. She would continue to respect Richard's boundaries regarding Charlotte as best she could. She would do her job with the same quiet efficiency that had always been her hallmark, but she would no longer make herself invisible, because invisible or not, homeless or not, she was a person with value, and she would not turn away from a child in need of connection, even if it cost her the job she so desperately needed. With that resolve firm in her mind, Mariah turned onto her side and fell back into a dreamless sleep, unaware that the next day would bring a collision of worlds that none of them, not Mariah, not Charlotte, and certainly not Richard Everhart, could possibly be prepared for. Morning arrived with persistent rain and gray skies. Mariah woke early, before most of the shelter's other occupants, and quietly gathered her belongings. Her uniform, the only thing of real value she had left, was carefully folded in her backpack, slightly wrinkled but presentable enough. She'd have to iron it in the staff room before Mrs. Winters saw her. The shelter's communal bathroom was crowded with women preparing for the day. Some headed to jobs, others to appointments with social services, many with nowhere specific to go. Mariah waited patiently for her turn at the sink, where she washed her face and brushed her teeth with the travel toothbrush and sample-sized toothpaste she kept in her backpack. Her reflection in the spotted mirror told a story she didn't want her employers to read. Dark circles under her eyes, a tightness around her mouth that spoke of stress and uncertainty. Mariah did her best to mask these signs, applying the minimal makeup she had salvaged from her car before walking to the shelter last night. "You look nice," said an older woman beside her, applying lipstick with a practiced hand. "Job interview?" "Just work," Mariah replied with a small smile. "Thank you, though. Whatever it is, you hold on to it," the woman advised. "World's getting harder out there every day." Mariah nodded, the advice unnecessary but the concern behind it touching. "I intend to." Leaving the shelter, she faced her first challenge of the day: transportation. Her car was unusable with its broken window, and she couldn't afford to repair it yet. The Everhart mansion was miles away, too far to walk if she wanted to arrive on time. After a moment's hesitation, Mariah used one of her precious remaining dollars for a bus ticket, promising herself she would find a way to make up for the expense. The bus was crowded with morning commuters, people in business attire heading downtown, service workers in various uniforms, students with backpacks and headphones. Mariah sat near the back, her own uniform hidden beneath her coat, feeling both part of this working world and somehow separate from it. These people had homes to return to. She had a shelter bed, if she was lucky. As the bus made its way through Seattle's rain-slicked streets, Mariah's mind returned to the decision she had made last night. She would no longer make herself invisible. The thought both strengthened and terrified her. Invisibility had been her protection, her way of surviving in a world that often seemed indifferent to her existence. But it had also been a kind of prison, keeping her isolated, unseen, unheard. The bus dropped her 3 blocks from the Everhart property. Mariah walked the remaining distance quickly, mindful of the time and the increasing intensity of the rain. By the time she reached the staff entrance, her coat was damp despite her efforts to stay under awnings and trees. "Morning, Mariah," Elena greeted her in the staff room. "You're cutting it close today. Transportation issues," Mariah explained, removing her wet coat. "Is Mrs. Winters around yet?" "In the kitchen, going over the menu with Chef. You've got time to change." Mariah thanked her and hurried to the small locker room, where staff kept their personal items during the workday. She changed quickly into her uniform, using the iron to smooth out the worst of the wrinkles. Her hair, damp from the rain, she twisted into a neat bun at the nape of her neck. Looking in the mirror, she saw what the Everharts would see: a composed, professional domestic employee ready for another day of service. What they wouldn't see was the woman who had slept in a shelter bed, whose car had been broken into, whose entire life had been reduced to the contents of a single backpack. That Mariah remained hidden, not out of shame, but out of necessity. She stowed her backpack in her assigned locker and headed to find Mrs. Winters for her daily assignments. "Ah, Miss Taylor," Mrs. Winters said when Mariah entered the kitchen. "You'll be in the main house today. Mr. Everhart is working from home, so be especially mindful of noise. And Miss Charlotte has a tutor coming at 10, so the library needs to be prepared." "Yes, Mrs. Winters." "And Miss Taylor?" The house manager lowered her voice. "Mr. Everhart mentioned he was pleased with how thoroughly you polished the silver last week. Your attention to detail has been noted. It was as close to a compliment as Mrs. Winters ever offered." Mariah nodded, accepting the small recognition of her work. "Thank you, I'll start in the library." The day proceeded without incident through the morning. Mariah cleaned the library meticulously, ensuring the large table was clear for Charlotte's tutoring session and that all books were properly shelved. She caught a glimpse of Richard in his home office, door partially open as he conducted a video conference, his voice carrying that same authoritative tone she had heard during the garden party. By noon, Mariah had moved on to the main living areas, dusting the expensive art pieces and vacuuming the plush carpets. She worked efficiently, but thoroughly, finding a rhythm in the familiar tasks. This was something she could control, something she could do well regardless of the chaos in her personal life. She was polishing the grand piano in the main sitting room when she heard the patter of small feet behind her. "Hi, Mariah," Charlotte said, appearing in the doorway. She was dressed in her usual formal attire, a deep purple dress with a white collar, her blonde hair neatly braided. "My tutor canceled because of the storm warning. Daddy's still working, though." Mariah straightened, cloth in hand. "Good afternoon, Miss Charlotte. I heard there's quite a storm coming. The news says it might be the biggest of the year," Charlotte reported with the serious tone children often use when repeating adult information. "Mrs. Winters is worried about the power going out." Mariah thought of her car with its broken window, now parked in a public garage using the last of her emergency credit card balance. If the storm was as bad as predicted, she would definitely need the shelter tonight. "I'm sure everything will be fine here," she assured Charlotte. "The mansion probably has generators." "It does, 3 of them." Charlotte approached the piano, running a finger along its gleaming surface. "Do you play?" "No," Mariah admitted. "My mother wanted lessons for me, but we couldn't. They weren't an option for us." Charlotte seemed to understand the unspoken explanation. "My mom played. She tried to teach me, but I wasn't very good." She pressed a single key, the note hanging in the air between them. "Daddy doesn't like when I play now. He says it reminds him too much of her." The sadness in Charlotte's voice was palpable. Mariah's resolve from the night before strengthened. "Would you like to try a simple song? I can show you what little I do know." Charlotte's eyes widened. "But what about Daddy's rules?" "We'll be quiet," Mariah promised, "and if he comes, I'll take full responsibility." It was risky, undoubtedly, but the smile that bloomed on Charlotte's face made it impossible to regret the offer. The little girl climbed onto the piano bench and Mariah sat beside her, showing her how to place her small fingers on the keys for heart and soul. one of the few songs Mariah's own mother had managed to teach her before piano dreams gave way to more practical concerns. They played softly, Charlotte giggling when she hit a wrong note, Mariah gently correcting her finger placement. For a few precious minutes, the vast mansion didn't feel quite so empty or cold. The sound of thunder interrupted their impromptu lesson, a loud crack that made Charlotte jump. "The storm's getting closer," Mariah observed, glancing out the window at the darkening sky. "We should probably stop now." Charlotte nodded reluctantly and closed the piano lid with careful reverence. "Thank you for showing me," she said. "It's nice to play again." Mariah smiled and stood, returning to her polishing cloth. "You're welcome, Miss Charlotte. You did very well." "Mariah?" Charlotte remained seated at the piano, her expression suddenly serious. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course. Why do you always look sad when you think no one is watching?" The question hit Mariah like a physical blow. Had she been that transparent? "I don't know what you mean," she said carefully. "Yes, you do." Charlotte's gaze was direct, unflinching in that way only children can manage. "You smile when you talk to people, but when you're alone, you look sad. Like Daddy does when he thinks I'm asleep and he sits in Mommy's reading chair." Mariah set down her cloth, unsure how to respond. The truth was impossible. She couldn't burden an 8-year-old with the reality of homelessness, with the daily struggle to maintain dignity while sleeping in shelters and washing in public restrooms. But she had also promised herself she would no longer be invisible, would no longer pretend to be less than she was. "Everyone has difficult times in their life, Charlotte," she said finally. "I'm going through one right now, but it will get better." "Is it because you don't have a home?" Mariah froze. "What makes you say that?" Charlotte twisted her hands in her lap. "I heard Mrs. Winters talking to Chef yesterday. She said you were living in your car but trying not to let anyone know. She said it wasn't right, someone working here and having nowhere to live." The revelation that her secret was known, at least to some of the staff, sent a wave of shame through Mariah, followed quickly by anger at herself for feeling ashamed. She had done nothing wrong. The system was broken, not her. "It's complicated," Mariah said, struggling to find the right words. "Sometimes life doesn't go as planned, and you have to make difficult choices while you work to improve things." "But why don't you have a home? Don't you make money working here?" "I do, but," Mariah sighed. "Housing is very expensive, Charlotte, and sometimes other things happen that make it hard to keep up with payments." Charlotte considered this, her young face thoughtful. "We have 22 rooms in this house. Most of them are empty most of the time." The simple observation, delivered with a child's straightforward logic, brought a sad smile to Mariah's face. "That's true, but those rooms belong to your father, not to me. He wouldn't mind if you stayed in one, not if he knew you didn't have anywhere else." "I think he might mind very much," Mariah said gently, "but thank you for caring. That means a lot to me." Another crack of thunder, closer this time, shook the windows. The rain was coming down in sheets now, lashing against the glass. "I should get back to work," Mariah said, eager to end the uncomfortable conversation. "And you should probably find Mrs. Winters. She'll want to make sure you're not alone during the storm." Charlotte slid off the piano bench but made no move to leave. "Mariah, if you need a place to stay tonight because of the storm, you could hide in one of the guest rooms. No one would know." The offer, so innocent and genuinely kind, brought tears to Mariah's eyes that she quickly blinked away. "That's very sweet of you, but I'll be fine, I promise." "Okay," Charlotte said, clearly unconvinced. "But if you change your mind..." She left the offer hanging in the air between them as she finally turned to leave the room. At the doorway, she paused and looked back. "You know what my mom used to say? She said the bravest thing a person can do is ask for help when they need it." With that parting wisdom, delivered with the solemnity of a child repeating cherished words, Charlotte disappeared into the hallway, leaving Mariah alone with her thoughts and the sound of the escalating storm outside. The storm intensified as afternoon gave way to evening. Seattle's typically moderate weather had turned violent, with weather alerts buzzing on staff phones and news reports describing it as the worst system to hit the area in years. Wind howled around the mansion's corners, rain lashed against windows, and the distant rumble of thunder had become a constant companion. Mariah continued her duties, moving from room to room with practiced efficiency. But Charlotte's words haunted her. "The bravest thing a person can do is ask for help when they need it." Easy to say when you lived in a 22-room mansion. Harder to embrace when asking for help might mean losing the very job you needed to escape your situation. As she was finishing the last of her assigned tasks in the formal dining room, Mrs. Winters appeared in the doorway, her normally composed face showing signs of stress. Ms. Taylor, we have a situation developing. The National Weather Service has issued a flash flood warning for several areas, including downtown where I believe you mentioned you were staying. Mariah's heart sank. The shelter was in the flood zone, as was the parking garage where she'd left her car. I see. Mr. Everhart has instructed that essential staff should remain on site tonight rather than risk travel. Mrs. Winters consulted her tablet. As we have a full housekeeping rotation tomorrow morning, you qualify as essential. We've prepared the staff quarters in the East Wing basement. Relief washed over Mariah. A safe, dry place to sleep tonight without having to admit her true circumstances. Thank you, Mrs. Winters. I appreciate the consideration. It's Mr. Everhart's decision, the house manager replied, though her expression softened slightly. Given the severity of the storm, he's concerned about liability should staff attempt to leave and encounter dangerous conditions. Mariah nodded, understanding that Richard's gesture wasn't personal but practical, a business decision to protect his interests. Still, she was grateful. The staff dining room will serve dinner at 7, Mrs. Winters continued. Chef is preparing something simple given the circumstances. After that, you're free to retire to the staff quarters. We've provided basic toiletries and sleeping attire. Thank you. Is there anything else needed before then? Mrs. Winters glanced at her tablet again. Actually, yes, Mr. Everhart requested that someone check the library windows to ensure they're properly secured. The west-facing ones have been problematic in past storms. I'll see to it right away, Mariah promised. As Mrs. Winters departed, Mariah allowed herself a moment of pure relief. Tonight, at least, she would have a real bed, a hot meal, safety from the storm. It wasn't a solution to her larger problems, but it was a reprieve she desperately needed. The library was dark when Mariah entered, the only illumination coming from the occasional flash of lightning outside. She switched on a single lamp, casting the room in soft golden light that barely reached the tall windows along the west wall. As she approached them, she could hear the wind whistling against the glass and feel a slight draft. Mrs. Winters had been right about them being problematic. Mariah carefully checked each latch, tightening those that were loose and ensuring each window was properly sealed. As she reached the last window, a particularly violent gust of wind rattled the panes, making her step back instinctively. They always shake like that during storms. Mariah turned to find Richard standing in the library doorway watching her. He wore casual clothes, a simple gray sweater and jeans, so different from his usual business attire that for a moment she hardly recognized him. I was just securing them, sir, she explained. Mrs. Winters mentioned they can be troublesome. Richard nodded, entering the library fully. They date back to the original construction. I've been advised to replace them, but he trailed off, his gaze moving to the windows. My wife liked their character, the way the old glass distorts the light on sunny days. It was the first time Mariah had heard him reference his late wife directly, and the unexpected vulnerability in his tone caught her off guard. They're beautiful windows, she offered, unsure how else to respond. Yes. Richard seemed to collect himself, his professional demeanor returning. Mrs. Winters informed you of the arrangements for tonight. She did. Thank you for the accommodation. It's a practical matter. The roads are already flooding in parts of the city. He moved to one of the windows Mariah had just checked, absently running a hand along its wooden frame. Charlotte mentioned she saw you today. Something about piano lessons? Mariah tensed. It wasn't a formal lesson, sir. Miss Charlotte was curious about the piano, and I showed her a simple tune. I apologize if that overstepped. It didn't, Richard interrupted, surprising her. Charlotte's mother was teaching her to play before. He paused. I haven't encouraged her to continue. Perhaps that was a mistake. The admission seemed to cost him something, a crack in the carefully maintained facade of control. It's never too late for her to learn, Mariah said carefully. She has natural ability. Richard turned to face her fully, his expression unreadable in the dim light. Mrs. Winters tells me you've been good with Charlotte, despite my restrictions on your interactions. Mariah remained silent, unsure where this was leading. My daughter isn't easy to connect with, Richard continued. She's been withdrawn since her mother died. The therapists say it's normal, part of the grief process, but he shook his head. She talks to you, that's rare. Miss Charlotte is a remarkable child, Mariah said. She's observant, thoughtful, and deeply kind. She just needs people to see those qualities in her. Are you suggesting I don't see them in my own daughter? There was an edge to his question, but also something else. Uncertainty, perhaps, or a genuine desire to understand. I would never presume to make such a suggestion, sir. Mariah replied diplomatically. I only meant that children often show different sides of themselves to different people. Richard studied her for a long moment, then gave a slight nod. A diplomatic answer. Another flash of lightning illuminated the room briefly, followed by a crash of thunder so loud it seemed to shake the very foundations of the house. The lights flickered once, twice, then steadied. The generators will engage automatically if we lose power, Richard said. Though I hope it doesn't come to that. Charlotte doesn't like the dark. The casual mention of his daughter's fear, something a father would know, something that spoke of attention paid, humanized him in a way Mariah hadn't expected. If you've finished with the windows, you should join the others for dinner, Richard said, his tone making it clear their unexpected conversation was concluding. The staff quarters are basic but comfortable. Mrs. Winters will show you the way when you're ready. Thank you, sir. As Mariah moved to leave, another violent gust of wind rattled the windows, and she instinctively glanced back to ensure they held. In that moment, she caught Richard watching her with an expression she couldn't quite decipher. Curiosity, perhaps, or reassessment. Ms. Taylor, he said as she reached the door. Charlotte mentioned something else today. Something concerning. Mariah's heart raced. Had Charlotte shared her discovery about Mariah's homelessness? She seems to believe you're experiencing some kind of housing difficulty, Richard continued, confirming her fears. She was quite distressed about it. Shame and pride warred within Mariah. She could deny it, dismiss it as a child's misunderstanding, but that would mean continuing the exhausting pretense, the daily masquerade of stability. I'm between permanent residences at the moment, she admitted, choosing her words carefully. It's a temporary situation that I'm working to resolve. I see. Richard's expression remained neutral. And where have you been staying during this temporary situation? The direct question left no room for evasion. Various arrangements. Sometimes my car, sometimes with acquaintances. There's a shelter downtown that... A shelter? Richard interrupted, genuine surprise breaking through his composed exterior. You've been working here for weeks. You're telling me one of my employees has been homeless this entire time? The word hung between them. Homeless. A label Mariah had avoided applying to herself, preferring between residences or in transition. I prefer to think of it as a temporary housing challenge, she said, summoning her dignity, one that hasn't affected the quality of my work. Richard ran a hand through his hair, a rare gesture of discomfort. Why didn't you say something? Request an advance on your salary? The employment contract specifies no advances during the probationary period, Mariah replied. And I didn't want to begin my employment by asking for special exceptions. So instead you've been. Richard seemed genuinely struggling to comprehend her situation. Sleeping in your car? While cleaning my 22-room house? Put so bluntly, the absurdity of the contrast was impossible to ignore. Yes, sir. Another lightning flash, another rumble of thunder. The mansion's lights flickered again, longer this time before stabilizing. This is unacceptable, Richard said finally. I understand, sir. If you prefer to terminate my employment... That's not what I meant, he interrupted, irritation flashing across his face. I meant the situation is unacceptable. No employee of mine should be without secure housing. Mariah remained silent, unsure how to respond to what sounded like concern from a man who had previously seemed indifferent to his staff as individuals. We'll discuss this further tomorrow, Richard said, his businessman's efficiency reasserting itself. For tonight you have accommodation here. I'll have Mrs. Winters ensure you have everything you need. Thank you, sir, Mariah replied, careful to keep her voice steady despite the emotions threatening to overwhelm her. She turned to leave again, but Richard's voice stopped her once more. Ms. Taylor, Mariah. The use of her first name was unexpected. Charlotte was right to be concerned, and you were wrong not to ask for help. The echo of Amanda Everhart's wisdom, passed from mother to daughter to Mariah, was striking. Before she could respond, a tremendous crash sounded from somewhere in the mansion, followed by a child's frightened cry. Charlotte, Richard said, already moving toward the door. They rushed together into the hallway, following the sound to the main foyer. There, illuminated by emergency lights that had activated when the power finally failed, was a scene of chaos. One of the tall decorative trees that flanked the main staircase had toppled over, crashing through the glass display case beneath it. Charlotte stood frozen on the stairs, eyes wide with fear, pieces of glass scattered around her feet. Charlotte, Richard called, his voice tight with concern. Don't move. There's glass everywhere. But Charlotte seemed paralyzed, her small body trembling as another thunder crash shook the house. In the strange, shadowy light of the emergency lamps, her face was pale with terror. Without thinking, Mariah moved past Richard and carefully navigated the debris-strewn floor to reach the stairs. "It's okay, Charlotte," she said soothingly. "Just stay still for a moment." She climbed the few steps to where Charlotte stood, noticing with alarm that there was blood on the little girl's foot. She had already stepped on a shard of glass. "You're hurt," Mariah said, kneeling to examine the injury. "But it doesn't look too deep. We'll get it cleaned up right away." Charlotte's eyes filled with tears. "I got scared when the lights went out. I was trying to find Daddy." "I know, sweetheart, it's okay. Everyone gets scared sometimes." Mariah carefully lifted Charlotte into her arms, mindful of her injured foot. "Let's get you somewhere safe, and then we'll take care of this cut." As she carried Charlotte back down the stairs, navigating carefully around the broken glass, Mariah was acutely aware of Richard watching them. His expression was complex. Concern for his daughter, certainly, but also something else. Something that looked almost like recognition. "The first aid kit is in my study," he said, leading the way down the darkened hallway, flashlight in hand. "We'll need to check for glass fragments before bandaging the cut." In the study, Richard cleared his desk with a sweep of his arm, papers and devices clattering to the floor, an uncharacteristic action for a man so obsessed with order. "Set her down here," he instructed Mariah. Together they worked to clean and dress Charlotte's wound, Richard holding the flashlight while Mariah carefully removed a small shard of glass and applied antiseptic from the first aid kit. Charlotte whimpered, but remained brave, her hand gripping Mariah's tightly. "You're doing great," Mariah assured her. "Almost done now." "Will I need stitches?" Charlotte asked, her voice small. "I don't think so," Richard answered, examining the cut himself. "It's not too deep, but we'll have Dr. Bennett check it tomorrow to be sure." As Mariah applied the bandage, she became aware of how naturally they had worked together, herself and Richard, like partners with a common purpose rather than employer and employee. The realization was disconcerting. "There," she said, securing the bandage. "All better." Charlotte looked from Mariah to her father, then back again. In the beam of the flashlight, her young face was solemn. "Daddy, Mariah doesn't have a home. Can she stay here? In one of our empty rooms?" The directness of the question hung in the air, impossible to deflect or ignore. Mariah felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment. "Charlotte, that's not something we need to discuss right now," Richard began. "But Mommy always said we should help people when we can," Charlotte insisted. "And we have so many empty rooms, it's not fair that Mariah has to sleep in her car or at a shelter when we have all this space." Richard met Mariah's eyes over his daughter's head, a silent communication passing between them, acknowledgement of the uncomfortable truth Charlotte had laid bare. "Your mother was right," he said finally. "We should help when we can." He turned to Mariah. "It seems my daughter and I have some matters to discuss. But for tonight, at least, you have a place here." It wasn't a solution. It wasn't even a clear acknowledgement of her situation. But in that moment, as the storm raged outside and the three of them sat in the circle of flashlight beam, something had shifted. A connection had formed, tenuous but real. And for the first time since entering the Everhart mansion, Mariah felt truly seen. Dawn broke over Seattle with gentle light filtering through dissipating clouds. The storm had passed, leaving behind downed trees, flooded streets, and a city slowly awakening to assess the damage. At the Everhart mansion, power had been restored in the early morning hours, and staff moved about with quiet efficiency, setting things right after the night's chaos. Mariah woke in the staff quarters, momentarily disoriented by the unfamiliar surroundings. The simple but comfortable bed, the small bedside lamp, the sound of other people stirring nearby. For the first time in weeks, she had slept deeply, without the constant vigilance required in shelters or the cramped discomfort of her car. As she dressed in the fresh uniform Mrs. Winters had provided, Mariah contemplated the events of the previous night. The storm, Charlotte's injury, Richard's unexpected reaction to learning of her housing situation. None of it had unfolded as she might have expected. "You're up early," Elena remarked as Mariah entered the staff kitchen. Several household employees were gathered there, drinking coffee and comparing storm stories. "Some night, huh?" "Indeed," Mariah agreed, accepting a cup of coffee with gratitude. "Is Miss Charlotte all right this morning?" "Dr. Bennett already came and went. Said the cut wasn't serious, just needed cleaning." Elena lowered her voice. "But that's not the most interesting development. Mrs. Winters says Mr. Everhart called an emergency meeting with his financial team this morning. Something about establishing a staff housing assistance fund." Mariah nearly choked on her coffee. "What?" Apparently he was quite upset to learn that one of his employees, Elena gave Mariah a meaningful look, had been experiencing housing insecurity while working here. He's creating some kind of program to provide emergency housing assistance, rental subsidies, that sort of thing. The news was so unexpected that Mariah could only stare, speechless. I've been here 6 years, Elena continued, and I've never seen him move this quickly on a personnel matter. Usually, everything goes through committees, consultants, lawyers. She shook her head in wonder. Whatever you said to him last night must have made quite an impression. Before Mariah could respond, Mrs. Winters appeared in the doorway, her usual composed self despite the unusual circumstances. Ms. Taylor, when you finished your breakfast, Mr. Everhart would like to see you in his study. A ripple of curiosity passed through the kitchen staff, but Mrs. Winters' stern gaze quickly dampened any overt reaction. Yes, Mrs. Winters. I'll go right away. Mariah took a last sip of coffee, straightened her uniform, and followed the house manager through the mansion. In daylight, the damage from the storm was visible. A few water stains on the ceiling near windows, staff carefully cleaning up the last of the glass in the foyer, a temporary board covering one broken pane in the sunroom. The estate suffered minimal damage compared to much of the city, Mrs. Winters commented as they walked. The shelter downtown where you've been staying was evacuated due to flooding. I thought you should know. The information was delivered in Mrs. Winters' usual efficient manner, but there was a note of genuine concern in her voice that hadn't been there before. Thank you for telling me, Mariah said. They reached Richard's study where Mrs. Winters knocked briefly before opening the door. Ms. Taylor is here, sir. Richard sat at his desk, phone to his ear, but he waved Mariah in and indicated she should take a seat. As Mrs. Winters quietly closed the door, Mariah caught the end of his conversation. Implement it immediately. Yes, retroactive to the beginning of the year. I don't care about the budget implications, Marcus. This is non-negotiable. He listened for a moment, then added, Good. Send me the paperwork when it's ready. He ended the call and turned his attention to Mariah, who sat perched on the edge of the chair across from his desk. How did you sleep? He asked, surprising her with the personal inquiry. Very well, thank you, sir. Richard nodded, studying her with new awareness. I've been giving your situation considerable thought, Ms. Taylor, and I owe you an apology. Of all the ways Mariah had imagined this conversation beginning, an apology wasn't among them. Sir, when I established the probationary period policy with no advances or exceptions, I failed to consider that it might create hardship for employees in transitional circumstances. Richard leaned forward, hands clasped on his desk. That was short-sighted of me. And learning that someone working in my home has been homeless while I have unused space, well, it's forced me to reconsider several of my policies. Mariah remained silent, uncertain how to respond to this unprecedented candor. Charlotte asked why you couldn't stay here in one of our empty rooms, Richard continued. It was a child's solution, but it made me realize how simple compassion can sometimes be, and how I've often overlooked it in favor of policies and procedures. He opened a folder on his desk and slid a document across to Mariah. This is a revised employment contract. It includes immediate completion of your probationary period, a salary adjustment, and most relevantly, temporary housing accommodation in the estate's guest cottage until you secure permanent housing. Mariah stared at the document, hardly comprehending the sudden shift in her circumstances. Mr. Everhart, I don't know what to say. You don't need to say anything. This isn't charity, Ms. Taylor. It's a correction of an unfair situation. Richard's expression was earnest, more human than she had ever seen it. The cottage is small but functional. It hasn't been used since my mother-in-law's last visit, but Mrs. Winters assures me it can be ready by this afternoon. This is extremely generous, Mariah managed, emotion threatening to overwhelm her composure. There's one more thing, Richard said, his tone shifting slightly. Charlotte has asked specifically if you might consider a revised role within the household. A revised role? She's formed an attachment to you, Richard acknowledged, a complexity of emotions crossing his face. Since Amanda died, Charlotte has rejected most of the caregivers and companions we've arranged for her. But with you, she connects. He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. I've been attempting to shield her from further loss by discouraging attachments to staff who might leave, but I'm beginning to think that approach has only increased her isolation, and mine. The admission cost him something. Mariah could see it in the tightness around his eyes, the slight tension in his shoulders. Richard Everhart was not a man accustomed to acknowledging personal miscalculations. "What role did you have in mind?" Mariah asked. "Charlotte needs more than a tutor or a traditional nanny. She needs someone who sees her, truly sees her." Richard met Mariah's gaze directly. "As you do. I'd like you to consider becoming her companion and guide. The position would include the cottage, a significant salary increase, and more structured hours than household staff typically receive." Mariah took a deep breath, trying to process the rapid transformation of her circumstances. "May I ask what prompted this offer, beyond Charlotte's request?" Richard was quiet for a moment, his gaze shifting to the framed photograph on his desk. Amanda with a younger Charlotte, both smiling. "Last night when Charlotte was hurt, you didn't hesitate. You went to her immediately, knew exactly what to say, how to comfort her. I realized I've forgotten how to do that." His voice lowered. "Or perhaps I never truly knew." He looked back at Mariah, his usual mask of confidence momentarily set aside. "My wife was the heart of this house, Ms. Taylor. When she died, I retreated. Into work, into routine. I thought I was protecting Charlotte by maintaining structure, consistency. But I see now that I've been failing her in fundamental ways." "You haven't failed her," Mariah said gently. "You've been grieving too. Perhaps. But grief isn't an excuse for not seeing what's right in front of you." Richard straightened in his chair, composure returning. "So will you consider the position?" Mariah thought of Charlotte, her solemn eyes, her quiet wisdom, her loneliness. She thought of her own precarious situation, now suddenly stabilized by an opportunity she couldn't have imagined even yesterday. And she thought of Richard, a man slowly emerging from the protective shell of grief and privilege to recognize the humanity of those around him, including his own daughter. "I would be honored," she said simply. Relief visibly washed over Richard's face. "Good. That's good. Mrs. Winters will review the details with you and arrange for your relocation to the cottage." "Thank you, Mr. Everhart." "Richard," he corrected, "if you're going to be working closely with my daughter, I think we can dispense with some of the formality." Mariah nodded, still somewhat dazed by the rapid evolution of her status within the household. "Richard, then." A knock at the study door interrupted the moment. Mrs. Winters entered, followed by Charlotte, who brightened visibly when she saw Mariah. "You're still here," the little girl exclaimed, limping slightly on her bandaged foot as she hurried across the room. "Did Daddy tell you about the cottage? It has a little garden and bookshelves built into the walls." Mariah smiled, touched by Charlotte's enthusiasm. "He did tell me. It sounds lovely. And you'll be my teacher now? Not just for piano, but for other things too?" "More of a companion," Mariah corrected gently. "Your father thinks we might learn some things together." Charlotte turned to Richard, a hint of her mother's directness in her gaze. "Does this mean Mariah can stay forever? Not just until she finds another house?" The question hung in the air, capturing the uncertainty of all new beginnings. Richard looked from his daughter to Mariah, something softening in his expression. "Let's start with making sure she feels welcome here," he said. "The future has a way of working itself out when people take care of each other." It wasn't a promise of forever, but as Charlotte slipped her small hand into Mariah's, as the morning sun illuminated the study with warm light, as Richard Everhart looked at his daughter with new awareness, Mariah felt something she hadn't experienced in a very long time: hope. 3 months later, the guest cottage had transformed into a true home. Mariah's few salvaged possessions had been supplemented by practical items from Richard and personal touches collected with Charlotte during their weekly outings. Bookshelves overflowed with volumes they read together. The small piano Richard had moved from the main house filled the evenings with music lessons, and photographs, carefully taken by Charlotte with her new camera, documented their shared adventures. In the main house, subtle changes reflected deeper transformations. Richard worked fewer weekends, joining Charlotte and Mariah for picnics in the garden or visits to the science center. Family dinners became regular occurrences rather than rare events. The formal dining room saw less use as they gravitated toward the cozier breakfast nook, where conversation flowed more naturally and laughter became increasingly common. On this particular evening, as summer gave way to early autumn, they sat together on the cottage's small porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. "My teacher says I need to interview someone about their life journey for my project," Charlotte announced, leaning against Mariah's side on the porch swing. "Can I interview you?" Mariah exchanged a glance with Richard, who sat in the adjacent chair, reading glasses perched on his nose as he reviewed documents with less urgency than in months past. "That depends on what you want to know," Mariah replied. Charlotte considered this seriously. I want to know how you went from having no home to finding one with us. I think it's an important story. The simple framing, from homeless to home, captured the external journey but missed the deeper transformation that all three of them had experienced. How could Mariah explain that home wasn't just the cottage, but the connections they had formed? How Richard had learned to open his heart again? How Charlotte had rediscovered joy? How Mariah herself had found not just shelter, but belonging? Richard set his papers aside, his attention fully on them now. That's quite a complex story, Charlotte, and one that involves all of us. The best stories always do, Charlotte said with 8-year-old certainty. They're never just about one person. Mariah smiled, her heart full as she looked between father and daughter, both so changed from the distant, wounded people she had first encountered in this mansion. You're absolutely right, she agreed. The best stories are about connections, about how people find each other, help each other, and grow together. Like us, Charlotte said simply. Like us, Richard echoed, his eyes meeting Mariah's with a warmth that had grown steadily over the months. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the estate's gardens, Mariah reflected on the journey that had brought them here, from desperate homelessness to this moment of peace, from invisibility to being truly seen, from isolation to family, not by blood, but by choice. Nanny, Charlotte said suddenly, using the nickname she'd created for Mariah. Remember what you said that first night during the storm? That everyone gets scared sometimes? I remember. I'm not scared anymore, Charlotte declared. Not of storms or the dark or... She hesitated, then added in a smaller voice, or of losing people I love. Richard reached out, gently tucking a strand of hair behind his daughter's ear, a tender gesture that would have been unthinkable months ago. Neither am I, sweetheart. As darkness settled over the Everhart estate, the little cottage glowed with warmth and life, a beacon of the change that had transformed not just physical spaces but hearts. And in that light, three people who had once been lost in their own ways had found something precious, a home in each other. 2 years later, on a crisp autumn afternoon, Mariah stood in the garden watching as Charlotte, now 10, played the piano at the small gathering on the mansion's terrace. The girl's confidence had blossomed along with her talent, her fingers dancing across the keys as she performed the piece she had composed herself, a melody that spoke of loss and discovery, pain and healing. Richard moved to stand beside Mariah, his hand finding hers with the easy familiarity that had grown between them over time. She's remarkable, he said softly. She always was, Mariah replied. She just needed to be seen. The guests, a mixture of household staff, Charlotte's friends, and selected colleagues from Richard's reformed company, applauded as the piece concluded. Charlotte beamed, taking a small bow before running to embrace both Mariah and her father. Later, as evening approached and the gathering dispersed, the three of them walked through the garden together. Charlotte skipped ahead, her voice carrying back to them as she planned next week's science project. I never imagined this, Richard confessed quietly, his fingers still entwined with Mariah's. After Amanda died, I thought our chance at happiness was gone. Mariah squeezed his hand. Sometimes home finds you when you least expect it. As Charlotte called for them to hurry, Richard paused, turning to face Mariah fully. Thank you, he said simply, for teaching me how to see what matters most. In the golden light of sunset, three people who had once been strangers now moved as a family, not defined by blood or circumstance, but by the deliberate daily choice to love, to support, to truly see one another. And in that seeing, they had all found home. If emotional, justice-driven stories move you, don't forget to like the video, subscribe, and tell us which country you're watching from. Your support helps us bring more powerful stories like this.